Hi, I'm Rocio,
And I'm Ashley.
and today we're talking about Martha's Vineyard and how Florida funds were used to coerce and transport migrants. So, on September 14th, 2022, 50 Venezuelan and Peruvian migrants were flown on chartered planes from San Antonio, Texas to Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. The flights were arranged by DeSantis' aide, Larry Keefe, and the office of Florida, obviously Florida Governor Ronald DeSantis. Migrants were approached in Texas and offered transportation to a state where they would receive aid, which included jobs and housing. The migrants were never told that they would be sent to Massachusetts. They were taken to a hotel near a Texas airport and stayed there for days. The migrants were given McDonald's gift cards if they signed a consent to transport form. So, due to the condition they were kept in, the migrants signed the forms so that they would be able to eat. A day later, they were put on private jets and flown to Martha's Vineyard. They were escorted onto buses and then dropped off by the side of the road. And no one on Martha's Vineyard knew anything about the migrants until they arrived. With no warning, the migrants were met with a harsh reality in Massachusetts. Many were worried about missing their mandatory immigration check-ins, with their check-ins being scheduled all over the country. Before landing in Massachusetts, the migrants were given a pamphlet which included a map of Martha's Vineyard and a long list of available benefits. But of course, none of the benefits listed applied to them, and they were unaware of that at that time.
Before they left, Daniel says Perla gave them a $10 McDonald's gift card. He still carries his.
She said, "Here's a card, but I need you to sign this sheet." And we said, "Okay." We were hungry, so we signed it.
And she said, "You have to sign to be able to get the card."
This is what they signed, a consent to transport form. The migrants say the abbreviations for Texas and Massachusetts were filled in by someone else. Nowhere on the form does it say Martha's Vineyard. The next morning, the 50 migrants boarded the private jets. Daniel and Daisy were excited. It was the first time either of them had been on a plane. Flight data shows the jets took off at 8 a.m., stopped in Crestview, Florida, and again in the Carolinas to refuel. They landed on Martha's Vineyard around 3 p.m. The migrants were escorted onto waiting buses and then dropped off by the side of the road.
So, shown here is a brochure that the migrants were given before being left at Martha's Vineyard. It had a list of resources and facilities that they would be able to contact. They were told that these resources would be available to them, and they did not exist.
Before they left, Daniel says Perla gave them a $10.
So, this is the case that we're going to be referencing. It's the Florida Immigration Coalition, Inc., Americans for Immigration Justice, Inc., and Hope Community Center, Inc. They filed a suit arguing that Section 185 of Florida's 2022 General Appropriations Act violated the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause by discriminating against people of color, persons born outside of the United States, and those perceived to be born outside of the United States, and also the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution by attempting to supplant the existing federal immigration system. So plaintiffs argued that Section 185 of the General Appropriations Act attempted to implement its own classification and or characterization of immigration status. It provided an incoherent definition of the term unauthorized alien. So it continued to define authorized alien as a person who is unlawfully present in the United States according to the terms of the Federal Immigration and Nationality Act. So this would require the Florida Department of Transportation and Travelers to determine the complex nuances of immigration status and proceedings under the entire Federal Immigration and Nationality Act, which is seemingly impossible. Section 185 at its core basically attempts to rewrite national immigration policy, which Governor Ron DeSantis is not empowered to do. So the power to secure the U.S.-Mexico border or determine who can pass through it rests with Congress. By transporting people who are already engaged in the federal immigration process, Florida directly causes chaos in Congress's objectives. Section 185 attempts to control national immigration, which in turn makes it unconstitutional. And Ronald DeSantis himself took credit for the flights, which left the 50 migrants in Massachusetts with no aid and no resources. And he himself explained that this was funded through the 2022 Appropriations Act. So in December of 2021, Governor Ron DeSantis gave a press conference where he announced his priority to take actions to address immigration. He stated that his administration put out a budget that would be proposing a series of legislative reforms to address immigration. 2 months later, in February of 2022, the Florida House of Representatives introduced Florida House Bill 5001, which is the General Appropriations Act, for the fiscal year of 2023. Now, the first version did not contain Section 185 or any appropriation for a relocation program. It was first introduced on the Florida House floor on February 10th, 2022. On February 16th, the original iteration passed the Florida House and was certified to the Florida Senate. On February 17th, State Senator Kelly Stargill proposed Amendment 889818, which proposed a new draft. And again, this draft did not include any provision that allocated funds for any kind of relocation program. So the Florida Senate then referred HB 5001 to the Committee on Appropriations. And on March 10th of 2022, the Florida House of Representatives Conference Committee amended the General Appropriations Act, and they added Section 185, which appropriated the $12 million to the Florida Department of Transportation to contract with common carriers to transport people deemed to be unauthorized aliens out of the state of Florida. So only 4 days later, on March 14th, 2022, the Florida House of Representatives passed HB 5001 as amended, and that same day it also passed the Florida Senate. So this unusual timing did not allow the opportunity for the Florida legislature to debate Section 185. And additionally, Article 3, Section 12 of the Florida Constitution mandates that laws making appropriations for salaries of public officers and other current expenses of the state shall contain provisions on no other subject. So an Appropriations Act is not the right place for the enactment of general public policies on matters other than appropriations. Section 185 establishes substantive policy, not salaries or other current expenses of the state. The relocation program should have been scrutinized through legislative process applicable to substantive legislation, not slipped into the Annual Appropriations Act. But HB 5001, including Section 185, was presented to Governor Ron DeSantis on June 2nd, 2022, and of course he approved it that same day.
Continuing coverage now of the migrant crisis. Nearly 50 undocumented people are now in emergency shelters this morning out on Martha's Vineyard. A plane dropped them off on Wednesday. 12 News went to the Vineyard to show you firsthand what's going on. Kate Walsh joins us now live with more. Kate.
Well, Patrick, as we first reported on Thursday morning, about 50 Venezuelan migrants flew onto Martha's Vineyard Wednesday and caught the island and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts by surprise. Community members spent the day yesterday finding shelter for them at St. Andrew's Parish. They found food, health care, and also interpreters. Now, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis confirmed yesterday that 2 planes brought undocumented migrants to Massachusetts as part of his state's relocation program. Florida itself, home to a large Venezuelan population, DeSantis said sanctuary states like Massachusetts and New York should share some of the burden of the country's border policy.
The minute even a small fraction of what those border towns deal with every day is brought to their front door, they all of a sudden go berserk, and they're so upset that this is happening. And it just shows you, their virtue signaling is a fraud, okay? They are supporting policies that are just frankly indefensible.
Now, right after that, members of the Venezuelan community in Florida also held a news conference and called for DeSantis to stop using their human pain and desperation for political gains. In the studio, I'm Kate Walsh, 12 News.
Continuing coverage now of the migrant crisis. Nearly 50 undocumented people are now in emergency shelters this morning out on Martha's Vineyard. A plane dropped them off on Wednesday. 12 News went to the Vineyard to show you firsthand what's going on. Kate Walsh joins us now live with more. Kate.
Well, Patrick, as we first reported on Thursday morning, about 50 Venezuelan migrants flew onto Martha's Vineyard Wednesday and caught the island and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts by surprise. Community members spent the day yesterday finding shelter for them at St. Andrew's Parish. They found food, health care, and also interpreters. Now, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis confirmed yesterday that 2 planes brought undocumented migrants to Massachusetts as part of his state's relocation program. Florida itself, home to a large Venezuelan population, DeSantis said sanctuary states like Massachusetts and New York should share some of the burden of the country's border policy.
The minute even a small fraction of what those border towns deal with every day is brought to their front door, they all of a sudden go berserk, and they're so upset that this is happening. And it just shows you, their virtue signaling is a fraud, okay? They are supporting policies that are just frankly indefensible.
Now, right after that, members of the Venezuelan community in Florida also held a news conference and called for DeSantis to stop using their human pain and desperation for political gains. In the studio, I'm Kate Walsh, 12 News.
So, Governor Ron DeSantis' clear disapproval with immigration legislation continued with the passing of Senate Bill 1718. And it criminalizes people as human smugglers who knowingly and willfully cross into Florida with people they know or reasonably should know, are undocumented, and have not been inspected by the federal government. The legislation makes using E-Verify, which is a system that determines work eligibility based on immigration status, mandatory for any employer with 25 or more employees. It imposes enforceable penalties for those employing illegal aliens and enhances penalties for human smuggling. This bill also prohibits local governments from issuing IDs, identification cards, to illegal aliens. It invalidates ID cards issued to illegal aliens in other states and requires hospitals to collect and submit data on the costs of providing health care to illegal aliens. So this framework does not permit parallel or supplemental state immigration laws, which applies here. This anti-immigration law has been challenged by legal organizations. In July 2023, legal organizations filed a federal lawsuit challenging Senate Bill 1718. And again, the Florida government has exclusive powers over the regulation of immigration matters and has enacted an exhaustive framework via the Immigration and Nationality Act, which includes the smuggling and unlawful transport of non-citizens. And in Senate Bill 1718, with their terminology of smugglers who knowingly and willfully cross in to Florida with people who are undocumented or have not been inspected, it's unclear what inspected means. So the vagueness of the terms is where this gives room for over-enforcement, racial profiling, it opens up the opportunity for people that are in the United States who are in the process of seeking lawful immigration to be affected.
In a possible next phase of migrant transportation to Martha's Vineyard, Governor DeSantis went on a podcast hosted by conservative radio host Dana Loesch, where he addressed the potential influx of Haitian migrants who would be entering the state due to the chaos unfolding in the island. So DeSantis has recently urged the Biden administration for stricter immigration policies amid those conflicts including gangs breaking into jails and releasing criminals, and the city of Haiti facing a general homelessness and hunger. So as a result of this, DeSantis discusses potentially using the leftover money from the prior migrant conflict and using it to transport the Haitians who enter.
DeSantis is at it again, talking about sending migrants out of state. This time he's talking about Haitian migrants, sending them to Martha's Vineyard. Take a listen.
We do have our transport program also that's going to be operational. So Haitians land in the Florida Keys, their next stop very well may be Martha's Vineyard.
Now, here are the facts. We know Haiti is in turmoil. There's massive unrest right now because of gang violence in that country, and U.S. officials have talked about the possibility of a mass migration from Haiti to the U.S. There is no evidence that's happening at this point. Ron DeSantis is claiming he's just trying to defend his state. Democrats are suggesting this kind of maneuvering is really just about scoring political points.
So, like she said, this could potentially be a part of his political angle, and this is evidenced by the fact that the Coast Guard actually hasn't seen an influx of Haitian arrivals since the chaos began in the island. The DeSantis administration has deployed 250 plus officers and soldiers with helicopters, drones, and seacraft to the Keys in South Florida to seek the arrivals. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has recently encountered a boat with 25 Haitians, including 5 children unaccompanied, along with firearms, night vision, gear, and drugs. Like any human trafficking case, we have to look at the TVPA's definition of human trafficking. It includes 4 elements. 1, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person. 2, for labor or services. 3, using force, fraud, or coercion. And 4, for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So we need all 4 elements to form the human trafficking violation. So as we know, human trafficking occurs when a trafficker exploits a person. This is a trafficker-based analysis. We don't really look at the victim's actions. When they exploit a person by using force, fraud, or coercion to make them perform compelled labor or commercial sex. Although the cases that we talked about do not involve any compelled labor or commercial sex, it is very human trafficking adjacent because the actions of this human trafficking violation are satisfied, and so are the means. The actions can include recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person, which was done by the DeSantis administration in the migration of the individuals to Martha's Vineyard. And the means, although not forceful or fraudulent, although they could be seen as fraudulent, they were definitely coercive, with the McDonald's gift cards, withholding the food and the resources, actually not withholding anything. They didn't exist in the first place. So those 2 are definitely satisfied. So as we know, the human trafficking definition involves looking at the trafficker's acts, means, and purpose in trafficking the individuals. So this slide pertains to the first element, which is the action. Predominantly in this case, it was a consent issue and a movement issue, which are 2 of the key principles of this element of trafficking. So the first question is, was the migrant transportation voluntary? So a victim could initially consent to providing labor, services, etc., but then as circumstances change, the consent kind of gets warped and lost, and they end up involved in situations that they wouldn't have initially consented to if they had known of the nature, which was the same thing that happened in this case with the lack of knowledge and not really, promising resources that weren't really in existence at the time. So the analysis of consent focuses on the trafficker's conduct in targeting the victim, again, not the victim's conduct. A trafficker can target a victim after a victim applies for a job, or in the cases we've been talking about, migrates to earn a living. So long as the trafficker employs an exploitative scheme, the victim's prior consent is not relevant. So if at any point in the case, any of the migrants at Martha's Vineyard consented to anything, their consent wasn't really relevant so long as the DeSantis administration had this exploitative scheme to send them to Martha's Vineyard, whether it be for political reasons or purely just anti-immigration reasons. The next question we have to address is whether or not the migrants were displaced, which is important in determining whether movement of the migrants is a factor. Typically, when victims of human trafficking or of any crime are being displaced, they're being moved to a foreign area, an area that they don't really know much about. Maybe there's a different language being spoken, they don't know of the legal system, and usually traffickers, in this case the government, would take advantage of that. So neither U.S. law or international law requires that a trafficker or victim necessarily move across a border for an offense to take place. Traffickers can use schemes that take victims hundreds of miles away from their homes or exploit them in the same neighborhoods where they were born. Although movement to an unknown area, like I said, that is foreign or unfamiliar to the victim, will contribute to their susceptibility to be coerced and will victimize them. So the second element is the means, which is an analysis of the victim's demographics and their particular vulnerabilities to coercion. So victims can be of any gender, age, race, in our case, of any nationality, social status, economic background, or immigration status. Victims can also be female or male, although females are more likely targeted. They can be adults or children, although children are more likely targeted. And they can be foreign nationals or U.S. citizens, and in our case, these are foreign nationals, and in general, they are more likely targeted. Undocumented migrants are also the cases that we've talked about today, and people displaced by civil conflicts, which was the case of the migrants that were coming from Haiti, escaping the gang violence and the homelessness. These victims' vulnerabilities can include having little to or no social safety net, and that also goes for having little to no legal safety net. In the cases we saw before, they were promised resources that didn't actually exist, and even if the resources did exist, they would not know how to navigate those. They wouldn't know that they existed otherwise, so they really wouldn't know where to go for help if they were being subject to any sort of abuse, whether it be by the government or by a trafficker outside of the government. They wouldn't really know how to identify it in the first place. Poverty or economic hardship, those are the cases here. A lot of the migrants might have come for labor or might have come to escape civil conflicts like the ones in Haiti. So just the fact that they are migrant workers opens the door to them being abused and them being held maybe to debt bondage or examples like that. We also have undocumented immigrants and racial, ethnic, or other minorities. Because of the fact that they are minorities, they are more susceptible to being coerced, being abused, etc. So like I said before, the migrants in the cases we discussed had their particular vulnerabilities that made them more susceptible to abuse. And in the complaint that we discussed, subsection C states that Governor DeSantis has consistently targeted immigrants of Latin American descent. So they go ahead and list ways that the DeSantis administration did abuse of the immigrants and their status and their vulnerabilities. So the complaint alleges that the administration threatened immigrant communities with the passage of Section 185 and other acts, such as Senate Bill 168 and Senate Bill 1808. An FTT agent spoke to families, handed out gift cards, offered free flights to large cities that they were not aware of, and advertised assistance that she knew did not exist. Those were just some of the examples of the abuse. There's no evidence anywhere to even suggest that the purpose of Section 185 was fulfilled. Section 185 does not target human smugglers, and the coerced migrants were not really connected to human smuggling. So the other acts that I talk about are Senate Bill 168, which involves the anti-sanctuary cities. It was basically DeSantis's purpose to make it a point that no immigrants would have any sort of sanctuary, any sort of safety or resources by authorizing and requiring state and local law enforcement to act as federal immigration agents. He basically gave the law enforcement officials the authority that they should not have had. And Senate Bill 1808 required law enforcement agencies operating detention facilities to cooperate with the federal government. And he also prohibited state and local government agencies contracting with transportation companies from willfully transporting an unauthorized alien into Florida. So when migrants become victims, they have certain resources that they might be able to resort to. In this case, it is not the government, it is not the DeSantis administration, because they have made efforts to do the complete opposite. So usually migrants would go to the Americans for Immigrant Justice, Inc., aka AI Justice, who is a nonprofit organization and one of the 3 immigrant advocacy groups who were part of the complaint against DeSantis. So they operate locally, statewide, and nationally, and they champion the rights of unaccompanied immigrant children, human trafficking survivors, and domestic violence victims. So they do this by keeping track of immigration detention practices and policies, keeping families together, keeping victims informed of their rights, their resources, that they have emotional support as well as legal support. They empower survivors and pursue legal redress when justice so requires. And in the case today, they are a part of that legal redress. So following the conflict that happened with the DeSantis administration, AI Justice actually received a huge influx of phone calls from concerned clients who were fearing that their family members might have been transported outside of Florida. So in turn, this affected AI Justice's resources and left human trafficking and domestic violence survivors in a vulnerable situation with no safety net. Like we discussed before, having limited resources like this kind of causes victims to be left with no other form of redress. They have no resources, they have nowhere to look for support, and they are ultimately stuck and seeking opportunities where they might potentially be abused. Although the actions we discussed lack the necessary factor listed in the TVPA's definition of human trafficking, that being for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery, these actions can facilitate migrants ending up in environments that may lead to human trafficking or other types of abuses. Their vulnerabilities leave them unable to protect themselves, and especially when they're left in a foreign city with no resources. That clear vulnerability of the migrants involved and the exploitation of their lack of knowledge for possible political gain is very concerning. As charters such as these continue to run, how soon will migrants end up in environments which will further the opportunity for human trafficking and similar situations? With DeSantis already speaking on doing the same for migrants from Haiti, what safeguards will be put in place to assure that migrants will not be harmed? So far, it seems like none.
So just for reference, these are the articles that we used for research and for all of the information included in this PowerPoint. Thank you.
Thank you.